Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our presentations today. My name is Jade, and today I'll be presenting on the article titled Delinquency, Causes or Consequences of Social Exclusion. And this paper was done by Elmer and Riker and published in '05. And the paper is essentially examining the relationship between social exclusion and delinquency. It explores how exclusion from authority figures, whether that's teachers, police, or the legal system, can reinforce delinquent behavior. So, my goal today is to really just break down the key findings. This is a chapter, so it covers multiple studies. So I'm gonna make that as concise as possible for y'all and connect them to broader research and then discuss how interventions can address exclusion rather than just punishing delinquency. So at the heart of this article is the question, is delinquency a cause or a consequence of social exclusion? And this has been a classic debate in not only social psychology, but also criminology. So the term social exclusion refers to the lack of access to societal benefits, whether that's education, fair treatment under the law, or even economic opportunity. And people who experience exclusion often feel like they exist out of mainstream society. Elmer and Riker argue that delinquency isn't just about bad choices, but it's often a response to feeling alienated from authority figures and legal protections. Whereas social inclusion entails the protection of the law. And certain demographics such as children, males, lower social classes, and ethnic minorities face a higher risk of victimization. For example, let's consider how marginalized communities often experience policing. If law enforcement is seen as targeting rather than protecting, young people may reject the system altogether. And then this can lead to a cycle where they engage in delinquent behavior, not just as a survival mechanism, but as a statement of defiance against a system that they perceive as unjust. One of the key takeaways from the chapter is that our perception of authority shifts dramatically as we grow up. And so young children generally view adults and authority figures positively, believing they are benevolent and capable and just in their behavior. However, as children age, they become more aware of the limitations of authority figures and the imperfections of our legal system. Some of the studies in the chapter that were cited were on political socialization, which showed that attitudes toward authority in adolescence often persist into adulthood. And this is why it's really so important to understand when and how trust begins to erode. A real world example of this is stop and frisk policies in the US. So, research has shown that Black and Latino youth are disproportionately stopped by police. Even if they haven't committed a crime, repeated negative interactions create a perception of bias, which makes these youth less likely to report crimes or even seek help from law enforcement. And then the same dynamic manifests in schools, where students who feel unfairly treated by teachers are more likely to disengage and rebel. So we know that experiences in formal education can also shape attitudes toward authority, and lack of success in school uh, has been associated with involvement in criminal activities and the negative attitudes toward authority. So, what actually causes young people to reject authority? One major factor that's talked about in the chapter is this idea of perceived fairness. So, an article that was cited in the chapter was by this guy named Tom Tyler, published in 1990. and he did work on procedural justice and found that people don't necessarily comply with the law because they fear punishment, but they comply when they believe the system is fair. If they see some inconsistency, bias, or corruption, their trust disappears. And this idea applies across institutions. The legal system, firstly, so if a young person believes that police disproportionately target certain groups, they won't see law enforcement as legitimate. In education, if students feel teachers treat them unfairly, whether through some disciplinary actions or lower expectations, perhaps, they then disengage from school. And even in the workplace and economy, if an individual believes that job opportunities are limited to them based on race or class, they may turn to alternatives and sometimes even illegal sources of income. I think a good example of this is the school to prison pipeline, which is a concept describing how harsh school discipline policies disproportionately push marginalized youth toward the criminal justice system. And studies show that students of color are more likely to be suspended or expelled for the same behaviors that white students are getting warnings for. Over time, this creates an identity of exclusion. So these kids are thinking, if the school system doesn't support them, why should they follow its rules? Elmer and Riker argue that when young people feel alienated, delinquency becomes an alternative system of justice. So, delinquency, they say, serves three main purposes. Firstly, this idea of alternative justice. It has to do with if young people believe legal authorities won't protect them, they may take matters into their own hands. And gang violence, for example, is often framed as self help justice. So, delinquency as a way to address perceived injustices when the legal system fails them. Second is for protection and status. So this is developing some tough exterior or reputation, which then can deter victimization in environments where formal protection is absent. And finally, group identity. So re- rebellion against authority may be a way for these individuals to bond with peers and establish solidarity. So we see this dynamic in urban gang culture, but also in less extreme ways. We can consider online subcultures that form around rejecting mainstream institutions, for example. So these people who feel alienated from political systems, they might turn to extremist groups that promise this idea of real justice outside of the law. We've lightly touched on this throughout, but one of the most powerful arguments in the article is that school experiences shape long-term attitudes toward authority. If a student struggles academically, is placed in lower tracks, or faces discrimination, they start to see the education system as positioned and rigged against them. This connects back to Paul Willis's article that was cited. It was an ethnographic study of working class boys in Britain. And he found that many rejected school because they didn't see it as a viable path to success. Instead, they embraced alternative identities and sometimes through delinquency. So this matters because early school experiences predict later attitudes toward law enforcement, government, and other institutions. So if students believe hard work won't change their future, they're thinking, why should they comply with any authority? To summarize the key ideas from this article, first, social exclusion and delinquency are interconnected. When youth feel abandoned by institutions, they are more likely to engage in delinquency. Second, perceptions of fairness shape compliance. When institutions are seen as biased, youth lose trust and disengage. And lastly, intervention should focus on inclusion rather than just punishment. Harsh discipline often reinforces exclusion instead of solving the root of the issue. All right, I know that I'm not there, but I did offer y'all 2 discussion questions. If you wanted to pause and discuss, they're here for y'all. All right, let's move on to the next. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm also going to be presenting on Matthew Hornsey's article titled, "Why Being Right is Not Enough, Predicting Defensiveness in the Face of Group Criticism." And this is similar to the chapter, kind of like another review article. So I'll be summarizing a lot of various findings in a concise way for you all. And really, this review is exploring the complexities of group-directed criticism and why this criticism often evokes defensiveness, even if it's valid. And at a high-level view, it proposes that responses hinge on 3 key factors, which I'll go deeper into as we continue on. And today, I really just plan to break down the psychological mechanisms behind this defensiveness and also discuss how in-group versus out-group critics are received differently, as well as explore strategies for making criticism more effective. So, why do groups reject criticism? Well, the paper discusses how criticism is essential for growth, and without it, groups and institutions and even societies stagnate. But in reality, even constructive, well-intentioned criticism often backfires. Think about times you've seen this happen. Maybe someone gave a company a bad review, and instead of fixing the problem, the company attacked the reviewer. Or maybe a political leader faced valid concerns but dismissed them as fake news. I think y'all know who I'm talking about. So Hornsey asks, what predicts whether a group will accept or reject criticism? He argues that defensiveness isn't about accuracy, but it's about identity, power, and social rules. So now we're going to kind of get into the meat of the factors that shape this defensiveness, which would be like the primary model discussed in the article. So Hornsey identifies 3 factors that determine how a group responds to criticism. Firstly, attributions about the critic. So this involves assessing the critic's motives and agenda. People instinctively trust in-group members and mistrust out-group members. If a critic is assumed to care more about the group and have its best interests at heart, group members are more inclined to consider the criticism. But conversely, if the critic is seen to have ulterior or even destructive motives, their comments may be viewed with suspicion. Next is the idea of adherence to identity related rules. So this refers to whether the critic followed the appropriate norms in delivering this criticism. So norms might include keeping criticism in-house and avoiding criticism when the group faces external threats. So criticizing a group to an external audience might be seen as a violation of good group behavior. And then finally is strategic considerations. This involves weighing the long-term interests of the individual and the group when deciding whether to support the criticism. So group members might consider the strategic advantages and the disadvantages of expressing support for criticisms. There might even be pressure to show intra-group harmony and silence in-group criticism, especially in the face of intergroup conflict. So all of these factors together explain why groups often dismiss criticism, even when it could help them improve. One of Hornsey's biggest findings is the intergroup sensitivity effect, where groups react more negatively when criticism comes from an outgroup than from an in-group member. However, this effect is reduced when the criticism is delivered by a long-term member. All right, so let's see this in an example. Imagine a science student criticizes the methods used in psychology research. Even if their critique is valid, psychology students will likely react more defensively than if the same critique came from another psychology student. Hornsey's experiments show that this effect holds even if the outgroup critic is well informed on the topic. So it's not just about accuracy, it's also about who is delivering the criticism. This also explains political polarization. If a Democrat criticizes Republican policies, Republicans may dismiss it outright, even if the criticism is based on facts. But if a fellow Republican makes the same point, is then more likely to be considered. And the same idea would apply in reverse. So we know that people evaluate the same criticisms differently based on who is speaking, and that the effect occurs only when the comments are negative. Also know that attributing constructive motives to the critic mediates this effect. In-group critics are assumed to be motivated by a desire to improve the group, while out-group critics may be suspected of trying to score points or demoralize the group. This effect is found to be diminished when the in-group critic is seen as a weak identifier. So this leads us into why are in-group critics more accepted? Hornsey argues it's because we assume in-group members genuinely care more about the group, whereas out-group critics are suspected to having ulterior motives. I discussed that a second ago. These could be trying to weaken or attack the group. But even in-group critics must follow these unspoken rules or norms. Otherwise, they risk being seen as traitors. So what's the word I'm looking for? This like shared identity of groupie credentials lets these in-group critics be seen as sharing a common identity with the group. So using inclusive language such as we signals that the critic identifies with the group, expressing an ongoing commitment. And this then helps to buffer the critic against any defensiveness because it shores up their groupie credentials. And if a critic has been a member of the group for a long time, their commitment to the group is more self-evident. So this aligns with Hollander's 1958 notion of idiosyncrasy credits, where long-term members have earned the right to push the group in new directions due to their established commitment. But as I mentioned before, even in-group critics must follow unspoken rules. An example of this, otherwise they'll face consequences. So an example of this would be, let's think about whistleblowers. These are people who expose corruption in their own organizations. In theory, they should be celebrated for helping the group improve, but in reality, they are often fired, blacklisted, or even harassed. So this happens because they violated an identity-related rule. They aired internal problems to an external audience, which triggers defensiveness. Let's talk about the rules of acceptable criticism. Even when criticism comes from an in-group member, as I've mentioned before, there are rules that determine whether it will be accepted. First, keep criticism in-house. So criticizing in front of outsiders makes groups defensive. An example, a politician criticizing their own party behind closed doors might be tolerated, but then saying that same thing in a public debate may be seen as betrayal. Second, timing matters. So groups are less open to criticism when facing external threats. An example, companies facing lawsuits or bad press may double down on mistakes instead of just admitting fault to avoid looking weak. Third, language matters. So I briefly touched on this before, but using language like we instead of they increases acceptance. And finally, newcomers and low status members face backlash. So essentially, the longer someone has been in a group, the more they can criticize. An example, a junior employee who critiques their company will likely be dismissed, but then if the same thing is said by a senior executive, they raise the same concern, that might be taken more seriously. So, as discussed in the paper, Hornsey talks about how people hide their agreement with criticism of their group due to strategic considerations related to their long term interests, which can be independent of their genuine feelings about the criticism. And this behavior is influenced by both collective and egoistic strategic considerations. So there are countless reasons why people hide their agreement that are discussed in the article. So there are some social risks involved. Publicly agreeing with criticism can be dangerous because it might damage one's standing in the group. So individuals who do not conform to the party line may face social censure, and groups may distance themselves from members who reflect poorly of the group. Also, leadership concerns. So, leaders may view criticism as a threat to their individual performance, leading to increased negativity towards those who voice or support differing critical views. And this can create a chilling effect where others are less likely to voice their agreement. Also, impression management, where individuals may engage to protect their position within the group, especially when responses are visible to high status in group members. They might pretend to be more outraged by the comments than they really are. Also, this idea of fearing being ostracized or even harassed by the broader group membership for supporting criticism, leading them to withdraw as an act of self-preservation. This can create a spiral of silence, as quoted from the article, where the perceived lack of support for critics discourages others from speaking out. And then also just maintaining group harmony, where in situations of intergroup conflict, there may be pressure to show intergroup harmony and suppress dissent. Openly agreeing with criticism could then be seen as divisive and harmful to group unity. Implications: when can criticism create change? So, what makes criticism more effective? Hornsey suggests criticism is more likely to be accepted when it comes from a committed in-group member. It is framed as constructive rather than hostile, and it is delivered at the right time and to the right audience. This has major implications for organizations, social movements, and politics. Groups need dissent to grow, but critics must navigate identity rules and power dynamics carefully. To wrap this all up, here are a few key takeaways. First, groups react defensively to criticism, even when it's accurate. Who the critic is matters more than what they say. Timing, language, and audience shape whether criticism leads to change. And finally, encouraging constructive dissent is key to group progress. I again have two discussion questions for you all if you wanted to pause the video and talk about it amongst yourselves. But thank you all for listening to me talk for a very long time. But I hope that you found both of the articles very interesting. And of course, here are my references. Thanks.